Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Welcome to the Imaginaries podcast, where we talk about all things imaginary. And by all things, I mostly mean science fiction and fantasy. And because we're writers, I mean mostly books. But we do talk about a fair amount of television and movies.
We talk about movies a lot. What are you talking about? We did a whole podcast on Arrival.
That's true. And you're in luck if you are more of a movie watcher than a book reader, or if you like doing both things. We don't judge. Because today on the podcast, we are going to talk about Fantastic Beasts and where to find them. Specifically, finding them in the movies, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, and The Jungle Book.
The live adaptation of The Jungle Book, which was released this year. Just to differentiate it from the animated version, which we all grew up with and was deeply problematic, but loved anyway.
Right,
and,
which was released in like 1786 or something.
Not 1786, but 1967, so not far off.
Ah, yes.
And we also are not necessarily going to discuss Rudyard Kipling's text, which was the inspiration for The Jungle Book, although that might come into things a little bit. Both of our movies were inspired by books.
Yes, true.
So we'll talk about that some.
For sure. So where do we want to start? I think what we're going to do is... Sorry, I asked you where you wanted to start, and then immediately said something. So
tell me where we're going to start.
What we're going to do, dear listeners, is move back and forth between the two movies as they complement each other, as we pick up on some similar ideas. We're not going to do just one and then just the other. So we're going to try and let this conversation evolve organically. With that said, do you have a particular place where you would like to start, either with one or the other, or... Yeah, where do you want to start?
I do, and I know this is a little bit of a cop-out, but as someone who hasn't seen Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, and knowing that this is still a relatively new release, it's kind of the big fantasy movie of the winter-fall season, you know, I would like to hear what it's about, and, you know, maybe a little bit about its history, the written history, where it comes from, like the context for this movie.
Yeah.
So, yeah, could you talk a little bit about that? I know that most of our listeners are going to, you know, like, who cares about The Jungle Book? I want to hear about Fantastic Beasts. It's the movie in theaters, so let's talk about that one.
For sure. So let's go all the way back to some years ago. I don't remember when exactly. But I want to say this was around the time it was around the time Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire was released. Maybe closer to Order of the Phoenix. I don't remember exactly. But Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them and Quidditch Through the Ages were a pair of slender titles that JK Rowling wrote, I believe, for charity, actually. Or rather, the proceeds from the sales of those two books would benefit charities. They weren't really side stories per se. They were more like explorations of the world that she had created. Specifically for Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, it was more or less exactly that. It was kind of a magical zoology text. Here's what this animal is. Here's where you're going to find it. Here's some of its bizarre things that it does. Here's how dangerous it is. Here's how wizards use it or have used it. So there definitely is no story there. So Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them is not an adaptation of the book Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. Or rather, it's not an outright adaptation. It's more playing with the mythology that's between the pages. There's a wizard named Newt Scamander who is responsible for, in-universe, this book, because he's a magical zoologist, which I don't really think that he is, and we'll get to that in a second. But in the universe, he's the one who's responsible for the book. So we see him in the 1920s, specifically in 1920s New York, as a magical zoologist, going around and getting involved in some shenanigans, getting bound up in some wizardly politics and what's going on in the United States at that point. It's basically a jazz-era period piece, plus wizards, plus conservation.
And it's made more weird by the fact that it crosses several lines with adaptation. since it was the screenplay was written by JK Rowling herself.
Yes.
So this is kind of a weird entry into the Harry Potter canon, but it's likely to actually become as much an established Harry Potter series, for lack of a better term, because it's been optioned for 5 films total.
Right. It's also worth noting, before we get any further into it, that it is, even though the Harry Potter universe has traditionally been a children's or young adult series of books, the movies, got towards older young adults. The characters in this movie are almost entirely adults. So we do have a couple of characters who are teenagers or children, and they are fairly integral to the movie. But for the most part, this is a movie that tracks the adult lives of adults living those lives. So
in the Jazz era, which is a pretty
in the Jazz era,
mature era to be setting a film in, for lack of a better expression.
Yes, I just also want to say that the pitch, wizards in a Jazz era period piece, is kind of like, I would be sold on that up and down, like, take my money, just make it happen.
Okay, so just like then to follow that up, that's who the main characters are, Newt Scamander and company, and this takes place in Jazz era. Did you say New York?
New York City, yeah. New
York City, and magical animals get loose. That's kind of like the plot, and they're trying to catch them, correct?
It's definitely, there's more to it than that, but that's definitely enough to be going on with.
Okay, so let's just move right along to how it worked. Did you like it?
I did like it. And wow. I don't know at this point whether that's going to be a controversial opinion or not. I liked it for several reasons. Let me tell you why. First, I unabashedly like the Harry Potter universe. I was 11 when Sorcerer's Stone came out. Harry Potter was also 11 in Sorcerer's Stone. So I had that lovely experience of growing up with them. Right. And definitely, they weren't released one a year, so I grew up faster than the books were released. So I think I was in college by the time the last one came out. But it was definitely a thing that, the Harry Potter books accompanied me through teenagerhood. So I like the universe. It's, definitely a foundational universe. It was not the only book series that I read, but it was one that was able to track me over several years. So I enjoy being able to return to that universe in a different way in this movie. So what I really appreciated in this movie, though, and here I'm going to get into some more of what's going on beyond the simple plot that we introduced, but one of the subplots which ends up tingling quite nicely, I think, with the main plot is the story of a boy named Credence, who is a wizard, who discovers that he's a wizard. Maybe not a wizard in the traditional sense, and I won't give away how exactly that comes to fruition, but essentially his story is the same story as Harry Potter. He's a wizard who's taken in by guardians who don't believe in magic and who actively want to stamp out that magic. He's an orphan who's downtrodden, who's abused by those guardians, and who eventually finds wizards who want to bring him away from all of that and show him their world, show him a new world. In Harry Potter, we have 7 books of what comes next, and it's kind of lighthearted in a very Roald Dahl kind of way, in that shit is going on and shit is real, but let's kind of color it in pastels and be tongue-in-cheek, and the only way we can talk about this is to sort of coat it in candy. Which is not a bad thing. I love Roald Dahl. I love what the Harry Potter books do. I am on board 100% with all of that. What we get in Fantastic Beasts is not that. We get a teenage boy who is abused by his guardians, and it sucks, and it's awful, and we get into the psychological turmoil that he has gone through because he's been abused for so long.
Do you think that this is a reaction to some of the criticism she's received, JK Rowling has received over Harry Potter, which essentially never examines the emotional consequences of anything?
That's a really good question. I Now, obviously, I'm not JK Rowling, and I cannot answer for her. However, this feels to me less like a way to say, oh, no, but I was actually thinking of those things, and here, look, I can do it, here's what it looks like. And more like, well, that wasn't Harry Potter's story. This is the story of someone who went through something very, very similar, and what happened afterwards. Because I think on the one hand you can sort of take that as an argument for like not essentializing abuse and what happens to survivors of abuse. Because, you know, at the same time that without Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, Harry Potter could almost be seen as, yeah, maybe abuse happens, but it's fine. Like, everyone turns out okay as long as they go into like a semi-supportive environment. And I'm saying Hogwarts is a semi-supportive environment because all of Harry Potter. But, you know, what this is essentially doing when you consider them both at once is saying, well, you can have very, very similar circumstances, and yet really different consequences for the people who suffer from abuse. And I think that that's actually kind of a more advanced thing than I was expecting this movie to do.
So, in a sense, we have everything that JK Rowling has written, including the screenplay. I have not yet had the pleasure of actually seeing the play, but the screenplay for the Harry Potter sequel. It seems to be an experiment in parenting, I would say, or an experiment in similar childhoods playing out differently due to different personalities or nurturing environments. So, you know, Voldemort and Harry Potter they had similar backgrounds. They were meant to be foils to each other, and they turned out differently. And so this character continues that fine tradition, essentially, this Credence.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. So, do you think that Credence was meant to be the point of Fantastic Beasts, or is he kind of this interesting thing happening in the margins?
That's a really interesting question, because certain things happen at the end of the movie that made me believe that Credence as a character would not be returning for subsequent movies. And I knew that it was going to be a series going into it. So I was sort of looking at, like, you know, what are they going to bring forward, what's going to carry over here, who's going to show up again. But I do think there are ways that he could come back. I don't think that he's the Harry Potter of these series for sure, like he is not the main character. But exploring what happens to him after the events of this movie would be really fascinating. And I do hope that we go in that direction. I think that the Harry Potter universe writ large, all the books, and now this movie and the new movie series that will follow, is at its best when we're dealing with character moments, when we're thinking not about the large operatic struggle of like good versus evil, but rather when we're actually in the heads and hearts and minds of the characters. Because Voldemort was so much more interesting to me in the flashbacks we got in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince than he ever was as a main antagonist. Dolores Umbridge was so much more effective an antagonist than Voldemort ever was.
Oh my god, she is my favorite antagonist in that entire series. And part of it is the acting. She was brilliantly acted. So that, I don't know how much that distracts from your point or not, but
no, I think
the way Harry Potter films and JK Rowling scripts are acted has all the meaning in the world.
Yes, for sure. And I think that there's, especially in these movies, there's definitely the potential for hamminess and for playing it over the top. And I know that some people definitely do that. But what I liked about this movie, and what I like about the best portrayals of the Harry Potter movies, of any of the Harry Potter movies, is that the ones that tend to be best are the ones that really find that character-driven heart in the piece, that don't go for the giant good versus evil and how you capture that. And that maybe explore some of those interesting character quirks. I really liked Newt Scamander, as played by Eddie Redmayne, And I wasn't necessarily expecting to. But one of the reasons why I liked him so much is that, again, he's sort of relatable in the way that Harry Potter tried to be relatable. You have this sort of, like, nerdy outsider kid in glasses who, you know, is totally new to this whole world and doesn't know how it works. And that's who you have in Harry Potter. In Newt Scamander, you kind of have, I don't want to say Harry Potter grown up, because he is not, but more like the kids who read Harry Potter growing up. He's a scientist. He is someone who cares very deeply about the things that he cares about, specifically animals, magical animals, and getting other people to care about magical animals and not just eradicate them or ignore them or whatever. He doesn't get along super well with others. He's sort of stumbling his way through things, you know, figuring things out. He's very competent when it comes to animal handling, but he's not really competent when it comes to things outside of that. But he's very, very relatable. And that seems like an intentional decision on JK Rowling's part to make someone that is a whole character, as played by Eddie Redmayne, and yet is someone who these grown-up fans of Harry Potter can sort of step into and say, I understand what you are, because it's sort of what I have maybe become. And again, I don't want to essentialize Harry Potter fans. There are millions of them. There are billions of them, probably. But I think that the goal of this character, or one of the goals of this character, was that relatability.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that actually provides a really handy transition point to the other film that we're going to be talking about today, which is The Jungle Book.
Yeah.
So this is a movie that you have not seen, correct?
That is true. I do want to see it at some point, but I have not yet been able to.
Well, the reason why we're bringing it up is because I just had a chance to watch it because it is now streaming on Netflix. So it is easy for those of us who are not able to find time in our schedules or money in our wallets to go see it in theaters. We now can watch it on the small screen, which is great. So I sat down and watched this. I had desperately wanted to see it in theaters, but was not able to make it work, because this is perhaps the most memorable Disney storyline from my childhood. There are several others that I remember well, like The Fox and the Hound and Robin Hood. I would say that those are probably the three classics that I was most captured by, and they all have deeply problematic elements, but but they're also perhaps the catchiest tunes, the most fantastical characters, to steal a line from your playbook. And so when this one came out, starring an actual person of color in the leading role, I was really excited to see what the studio could make of it in 2016 that they didn't all the way back in 1967. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the animated film. Can you believe that?
Yeah, that's true. Next year. Wow.
Yeah, it's impressive. So there's a very long legacy to contend with in The Jungle Book that you don't have in Fantastic Beasts. So a lot of my thoughts about this movie are shaped by what has come before. For those of you who haven't, God help you, read the book or seen the animated version, this is actually the second live-action adaptation by Disney.
Is it?
There was one in 1994, which I did not see.
Really?
So, yeah, I think I think that's probably the least preferred in the Kipling canon. But
weird. I had no idea.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. But at the same time, each movie makes some very strategic blunders. I say strategic, but I don't know if they were strategic or just unfortunate.
Yeah.
So, for those of you who haven't read or watched, etc., The Jungle Book is set in the jungle, and it theoretically features a boy, an orphaned boy of color, who is adopted by the jungle animals. And Kipling mostly used this storyline to set forth moral precepts. So the Jungle Book is actually a collection of Kipling works that were kind of anthologized together. And so the narrative that we tend to think of in respect to the Jungle Book is something that was invented by Disney to tie all of these morals into something fluid and continuous. So it's moralistic, it's a fable, it's a fairy tale. It's one of Disney's stronger showings in terms of creating a character that feels more than just a cardboard cutout. So Mowgli, the boy, the orphan boy, is a very interesting character. He's an orphan. He's been raised by people, for lack of a better term, who are not actually people. And then he's placed into this conflict with actual humans and trying to figure out who he is. So it's a quest for identity. It's a coming of age story. Very, very stereotypical in that respect. But at the same time, Disney is mostly known for princess stories at this point. Princess stories which are less about finding oneself than they are about finding one's significant other. Whether that significant other ends up being a sister, as in Frozen, or a boy. It's always a boy. Can't wait for my first gay Disney movie.
Right? That would be awesome.
Yeah, can't wait. Anyway, so this version looked at the animated version, which was kind of this bumptious, rambunctious musical adaptation of that moralistic story. And it was like, okay, so we made some mistakes there. We had some slip-ups on the racist front. And we want to do better. So they did take some steps. They did actually employ some people of color in the cast and the crew. My problem with how that played out is, so Bill Murray plays Baloo the bear, who befriends Mowgli. Ben Kingsley plays Bagheera, the Black Panther, who teaches Mowgli how to survive. And Scarlett Johansson plays Kaa, this python that tries to seduce him a little bit. I mean, like eat him, seduce him into being eaten.
Yeah.
And Christopher Walken plays King Louie, this Gigantopithecus, this giant ape who tries to press gang him into teaching the monkeys how to use fire. And all of those major characters are white males.
And
except for Scarlett Johansson, who is like the epitome of a white female. And Scarlett Johansson's been caught up in whitewashing sort of problems outside of this movie. And that film, we will probably both see at some point, correct?
Probably.
Ghost in the Shell. We're talking about Ghost in the Shell.
Yeah.
She was cast as a character of color. So an actress who's white cast in the position of a character of color, that's always problematic. In this case, in The Jungle Book, it's complicated by the fact that you have a book about people of color that was written by a white man at the very core of it. So like there's going to be some residual colonial impulses that have to be dealt with, but just employing white male actors and Scarlett Johansson as your representatives of colonialism. I don't know. Anyway, so there's only two other major characters apart from Mowgli himself who are acted by people of color, and these are of course voice actors. And it's Idris Elba who has the best voice acting voice.
That's true.
In history.
Yes.
And he plays Shere Khan, a villain. And Lupita Nyong'o, who is now also in the Star Wars franchise and who was made famous by 12 Years a Slave, she is the wolf who adopts Mowgli. So you have one person of color, apart from Mowgli, who's a positive representation, and then you have perhaps the most important role apart from Mowgli in the film is given to a person of color, and it's the villain. And so that I don't know, if you're going to hire people of color in your voice cast, please don't cast them symbolically as both the noble savage and the savage savage. That's problematic. So anyway, so all of this to say, the movie makes some strides ahead of its predecessors, but it also, it's one of those 2 steps forward, 1 step back situations. And I find that very interesting because you have some similar co-opting concerns of history in Fantastic Beasts. So apart from actually having Fantastic Beasts in the Jungle Book, we also have similar concerns in this conversation about what we do with other people's histories, and do we respect them or not? Do we do all that we can to allow the voices that need to be heard? And I would say that this does some good. This does some good, and but not enough, in my opinion, to completely redeem it. However, the CGI is fantastic. The important songs from the musical version are there, although one is placed in the credits so that it doesn't interrupt the story as much. And the story does strip out some of the incredibly problematic elements in the animated version, namely the ending. Do you remember the ending of the animated one?
Not in the slightest.
Okay, so the basic storyline of the Jungle Book is this orphan is kind of cast out of this group of animals that has raised him because Shere Khan, the tiger, has a grudge against humanity and against fire. And as a human, Mowgli represents everything that this tiger has been inculcated to fear and hate. So Shere Khan is hunting Mowgli across this landscape, and Mowgli is trying to find his people, find out his story, find out who he is. And these are story elements shared across almost all of the adaptations. So he's off hunting for who he is. He gets separated from Bagheera, who is his protector, and he falls into the company of Baloo, this sort of bear who, look for the bare necessities, the simple bare necessities.
That one.
Forget about your worries and your strife. I mean etc.
Yep.
So he falls into the company of this bear who's a bumbling fool and ends up in more danger than ever. And Shere Khan and Kaa and various other characters, including King Louie, all threaten his physical security. So he is being pushed and nudged and shoved towards the human settlement. He doesn't want to go because he spiritually belongs with the animals. He was raised by them. He espouses their egalitarian lifestyles, at least as they're presented in the book. I mean, we all know that nature is more complicated than that, but it's still simple and moralistic in that. So then he, at the end of the animated version, the 1967 version, he's protesting and protesting and protesting. He's finally been reunited with all his animal friends, but they're saying, no, you really don't belong with us. You do ultimately belong with man. And he's like, no, no, no. And then he sees a girl walking through the woods, and she smiles at him. And he goes googly-eyed and falls in love and follows her into the human settlement and is lost to the animals who raised him and loved him forever. And this version is no, that's lame. He belongs with the animals, so he's going to stay with the animals. Spoil alert. He solves their issues. His intelligence and his humanity, essentially his ability to employ tools and what Bagheera calls tricks. He uses those to help save the animals and improve their lives. So you have this merger of human abilities with animal philosophy at the end of the new adaptation that I find really fascinating. So that's the plot. That's where it begins and where it ends. But that's not ultimately what's most interesting about the 2016 Jungle Book. And I don't think the plot is what's most interesting about Fantastic Beasts, just based on what I've heard you say. We can talk about whitewashing casts from now until when the cows come home. But why don't we talk about something that we perhaps have more an understanding of, which is, or more of a foothold in discussing, which is anthropomorphism and its relationship with anthropocentrism.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think? What are these movies saying about how we view animals and more largely the worlds we inhabit?
What a good question. I really want to talk about this and think about this because there's such an unobvious divide in human versus animal, or intelligent versus non-intelligent, or emotional versus non-emotional in Fantastic Beasts. In the Harry Potter world more largely, but the Fantastic Beasts have never really been the focus of things in the same way that they are here. Like, we sort of vaguely understand that animals in air quotes, like dragons or unicorns or thestrals in the Harry Potter books, are intelligent and sort of like maybe have their own lives, and wizards sometimes come in contact with them. But we never really explore that in detail. We also don't really explore it in detail in Fantastic Beasts, but we do more with it for sure. I do want to say, not as an aside, but as a follow-up to something that you hinted at a little earlier, we've definitely been paying attention to conversations that respect not in Fantastic Beasts directly, but in the material that JK Rowling produced prior to Fantastic Beasts to sort of explain where wizarding society in North America came from. A lot of those ratings kind of co-opted and reappropriated the beliefs and the histories of indigenous people in North America. I don't know what that sound was. But we don't have a whole lot to add to that discussion other than saying that we want to respect it and make sure that those voices are heard. So please, if you are someone who did take part in those conversations and want to add more to our conversation, we very much invite you to do so. And we want to give space for that because it's very important to talk about, especially since Indigenous peoples have undergone a lot of nasty shit.
Nasty shit is, that's putting it lightly.
For sure.
It's worth admitting here we are both, well, I am extremely white. I am glow in the dark white. And yet I live on a tribal reservation in Montana. I actually do live on a res. And you can't live on a res or near a res in the case of you, Tony, in the Tucson area. You're close to the Tohono O'odham reservation there. You can't live in the West, I would say, without having to grapple with the appropriation of Native history, the stigmatization of Native history, the simplification of Native history, the co-opting of Native history. And this is ever more important the more we start to nationally come to terms with our history as colonists.
Yes.
And the Dakota Access Pipeline protest has really highlighted a lot of what's wrong about how we envision Native concerns and how we have this really bad habit of being the white person stepping in and saying, "Oh, that's a really cool Native thing. Let's all do this." And sometimes we're welcomed into that, and that's okay. And sometimes we don't belong there, and we have to step aside and admit that we are the inheritors of privilege.
Yes.
And so we just have to admit that and come to terms with that and lift up the voices of people who have the right to speak to that conversation. So we would like to lift up your voice as listeners who have opinions on this matter. And we would also like to just state as a blanket proviso for all of our podcasts that your concerns are valid and we want to hear more of them. So
yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a thing. That's a thing in Fantastic Beasts. That's a thing in the Jungle Book. The co-opting of Native concerns.
Yeah,
I mean, they're different settings, but it's there
for sure. And I mentioned it specifically here as a way to think about your question, which I think is really interesting. But this notion of what is considered human, what is considered intelligent, what is considered emotional, like, who is not the other in these sorts of relationships, very much has to do with that idea of indigenous appropriation, as much as it has to do with this idea of anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism in these movies. So I want to circle back to the question that you asked, because in Fantastic Beasts, I don't know how I feel about the magical creatures. I mentioned that I don't think Newt Scamander is really a magical zoologist, which is how he's put out there in a lot of the promotional material. I think he's more like a magical conservationist. He's trying to rescue viable breeding populations of magical creatures that have been hunted to extinction, that have been misused, and their endemic territories restricted, and have been hunted for whatever reasons, and so on and so forth. And basically they're just not respected by wizards in any way. And we see that a lot of these creatures are intelligent. And that's something that the Harry Potter world at large has grappled with. One of my favorite parts that was unfortunately completely removed from the movies is Hermione's quest to help house elves in the Harry Potter books. And I say help, and that's a little problematic, and I'm not entirely happy with how the books handled that, but just this notion of there are uncommented on slaves in a lot of wizarding households and dwellings and buildings that are another species entirely that is intelligent and emotional and capable, and they're used as slaves, is something that the world beyond Hermione never really looks at. I don't know.
Yeah. No, that for me has a lot of resonance, not with the Jungle Book specifically, but with another text that we've discussed recently, which is Mother of Eden, where Starlight Brooking is the only character sensitive to the plight of the sort of enslaved or indentured minors in Eden. So and that we discussed in that last podcast as being something that it bothered me. It bothered me because it's not embraced by everyone, or it's not actually it's not grappled with in a way that feels meaningful or fully developed, and that's like a really big deal. And if you are a writer of British extraction like Rowling and Beckett, actually, you have a pretty long legacy of enslaving people and colonizing nations, and you actually have a fairly well developed national conversation happening around this very topic. So why not make that a thing? Or if you're going to broach it at all, like you need to open up to the emotional ramifications of what you're inserting in your text. In today's literary community, many of your readers are going to be coming from the colonized nations or the colonized areas. They're going to be the inheritors of the oppressed. You can't as a British writer or an American author assume that your readers are mostly going to be British or American these days, because the market is global. India has one of the most booming literary and reading communities. China has an enormous market for American and British books. when you make a film like Fantastic Beasts or The Jungle Book, these days most of your profits come from overseas. Mm-hmm. Your domestic gross is great and all, mm-hmm. but the majority of your take comes from overseas. So yeah, I think if you're gonna bring that in, you better go full at it, mm-hmm. or or else you're essentially saying, I don't care mm-hmm. enough to develop this, and that's not acceptable when you're talking about something as historically devastating as slavery.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my long rant. I have a problem. I have a problem with incomplete slavery conversations.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's one of the unfulfilled promises of the Harry Potter books that I was obviously, since Fantastic Beasts goes back many decades before the Harry Potter books began. I wasn't expecting the sort of commentary that I was looking for that the Harry Potter books didn't deliver. And instead of doing more with that, they opened up even more questions. Like, is the Niffler intelligent? Is the Thunderbird intelligent? Are the different beasts that Newt Scamander is carrying around trying to preserve, is he trying to preserve them as animals, which is to say, thinking about what they need maybe biologically or ecologically, looking for suitable habitats, suitable resource needs in those habitats? Or is he thinking about preserving them, conserving them, looking out for their well-being as thinking, emotional, intelligent beings? In which case, their needs and their necessities are going to be kind of different. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Like, obviously, you'd care about, where you are, where, if it is the latter, then he would care about, what habitats, what resources, what shelters, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
But the movie never really makes it clear what's going on here. Or, I should say, the movie doesn't problematize, doesn't critically consider what is animal and what is not animal, and how are we drawing that line, and what are we considering, and how are we considering them, and so on and so forth. Like, it's just kind of like funny CGI animals. And before I go any further, I will also say that the funny CGI animals are amazing, and they did a wonderful job with them. And if this was just like... I'm big into nature documentaries, and I'm going to go completely simplistic on you for a second. If this was like a magical planet Earth and there was no story attached to it, I would have been equally happy about this.
Well, there's a reason why Planet Earth is popular. Mm-hmm. The documentary objective lens lends something to the story of animals and the examination of nature and conservation that a fantasy narrative doesn't.
Yeah, for sure. And we can talk maybe in another podcast about how the problems attendant to documentaries and how they also put up artificial lenses, especially if you're looking at intelligences that we know and recognize. But we won't get into that too much.
Sure.
Just this little bit. But what were your thoughts about some of these concerns, anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism in the Jungle Book?
So it's a little bit more straightforward than Fantastic Beasts, which is portraying animals, and they might be more complex, and that's part of the interest. In this Jungle Book, the animals are people. Like, I just have to say it. The animals are no different from people, except for the actual humans in the film, apart from Mowgli, are just, like, you see them from afar, you see them silhouetted against campfires, but you never actually talk to them. So Mowgli is the only human in this film who has a speaking role. His father is shown briefly, exiting a cave and being attacked by Shere Khan. That's like the only other human who gets his face shown on screen. And so the animals do the heavy emotional lifting here. They operate as human beings, even though they are they're representatives of a variety of species. You have a python, you've got a bunch of wolves, you got a tiger, you got a bear, got a panther, got a Gigantopithecus.
Right.
And all of his attendant monkeys. You've got all of these different animals, but they all talk to each other as if they were essentially the same species, just like maybe from different family groups kind of a thing. So like the wolf is one family, and then the zebras might be a different family, and the giraffes might be a different family. And so they use a really neat trick to kind of get past the whole predatory prey relationship. Very early on in the film, it's established that when in a time of drought, they will all agree to a temporary truce over water. So while they're at the water hole, they do not kill and eat each other. So all of the interspecies conversations, for the most part, happen around this water hole or around Mowgli. So so they get past the whole predator prey thing because nobody's killing and eating other animals.
Yeah.
And so that takes away the core, if stereotypical, sort of defining feature of what differentiates animals from humans. Nobody's eating each other. So so the animals operate as people, and they're anthropomorphized in that they are completely given over to human emotions, maternal instincts, threatened male alpha feelings, etc. And there's anthropocentrism there too, in that human concerns are the primary concerns. They're just cloaked in the beautiful CGI bodies of these animals. So this is a very human movie, even though it purports to be in a jungle and features jungle animals. Like they speak all the time. Their lips are moving like human lips. It's kind of weird, but okay.
Yeah, talking animals as a genre of CGI is just not a thing that I have ever been a fan of.
It's not handled poorly here. It's like the CGI is leaps and bounds beyond the original Chronicles of Narnia adaptation, for instance, with the animatronic Aslan, whose mouth just opened and closed. It didn't have like jaw movement or throat movement or lip movement, It was just like open, shut, open, shut. I'm talking. There you go. So yeah, I would guess that Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them has a lot more to say about how we relate to the natural world than the Jungle Book does. Because the Jungle Book is far more about how we relate to each other. And that's actually one of its strengths. Because if you were bringing in the predator-prey relationship or making these animals behave more like actual animals, the Mowgli's story and his coming of age and his hunt for identity would be distracted from. I think to maintain the purity of that narrative, you essentially have to simplify the background noise. And sometimes that background noise makes for fascinating stories in and of itself, like the Planet Earth. There are actual episodes of Planet Earth that deal with the animals and ecosystems being shown in the Jungle Book. So, I am fascinated in that stuff. Did it have a place in this particular adaptation? Not really. And it's more complex than its predecessors, but it's still a fairly simple story. So that would be where I land. Whereas I think Fantastic Beasts may have had the opposite problem, where it's trying to bite off more than it can chew.
I do wonder, and as we've noted in other discussions about series that are not yet complete, such as the Eden series by Chris Beckett, it's really difficult to critique one work in that series without seeing where it's going next.
Yeah.
My sense is that some of the magical conservation, the magical zoology that we get in Fantastic Beasts is not going to be carried out. And this was sort of a way to get into a new series of movies that considers a new struggle between good and evil in the wizarding world. And I have to say I'm not super excited about that, but I could also be very wrong, because I kind of can't imagine a way in which we would revisit these characters that wouldn't involve some of what we saw in this movie. It could also be that the movies shift main characters, but then this would kind of seem like a waste of a movie. So what happens next? I don't know. But I did enjoy this as a movie, and I will probably see the next one, as long as it doesn't crash and burn. But we'll see.
So I think, now that we're nearing the end of the podcast, do you have any final thoughts about the movie? Should people go and see Fantastic Beasts? Is it an important movie? And I could say that The Jungle Book is a good movie, but it probably isn't like a landmark. What do you think about Fantastic Beasts?
I don't think Fantastic Beasts is a landmark either. As for whether you should see it or not, I think it matters very much where you're coming from. If you're a fan of the Harry Potter universe, then it might be it might be a movie for you. If you're a fan of genre pieces that are also period pieces, probably also going to be a good match for you. Mm-hmm. If you're someone who connects with the biological sciences or creatures more generally, or if you have any interest in magical or fantastic creatures, I think you're going to be pretty happy with this movie, and then you'll deal with the plot, even if it's not really that great. So what I would say about this is that whereas I would recommend some movies and some books across the board, for example, when we did our podcast on Arrival, see Arrival if you haven't seen it yet. If you're listening to this, you at least like science fiction or fantasy a little bit, and Arrival is just a goddamn wonderful movie.
Oh, so good.
Whereas Fantastic Beasts, maybe, if you're part of one of those groups, give it a try. If you're not part of one of those groups or it looks good, give it a try, but don't rush out and watch it.
Sure.
Everyone.
And I think, just to close us out, I think there's a lot of hope for science fiction film, fantasy film in the coming year. 2017 has some very interesting films lined up. One of them is actually I don't know if you've seen the trailer for it. It features a familiar face from Harry Potter, and it's called The Circle. And it is essentially an exploration of what it would actually be like to live in a perfect surveillance state. Not necessarily a surveillance state that is deliberately hostile. That's not the sort of atmosphere I'm getting from it, but a surveillance state that is perfectly complete in its coverage of your life. Mm-hmm. And that has its own menaces to it. So it stars Emma Watson. And it looks fascinating. So everybody, just to close out this podcast, go out, watch some trailers, get excited about upcoming movies and books. We've so much out there that maybe isn't a sequel or a prequel or, some sort of tangentially connected piece to something else that came out 4 years ago. Just look for the films, look for the books that you enjoy. Things, topical things that you enjoy, characters that you enjoy. We are not here to cast shade at anyone's preferences for movies. So if you like Fantastic Beasts, if you like The Jungle Book, more power to you. We like that. We like that you are nerds over these things. And
we do.
We're really grateful that you took the time to listen to us talk about these things for 45 to 50 minutes today. So
yeah, for sure.
In closing, we are the Imaginaries. You can find us at www.imaginaries.us. You can also find us on Twitter at imaginary_pod. And you can follow us on SoundCloud or iTunes. And we really hope that you do so.
Please do.
Please do. Thank you, and have a great week.
Yeah. Bye.